Greetings from National College Trichy. A hearty welcome to the third videocast on literary periods, which is the period of Middle English. To begin with, we shall see the emergence of Middle English language. Middle English is the blend of Old English and Norman French and is the language spoken in many parts of England from 12th to 15th centuries. The Norman conquest had a significant effect on the Old English and had changed it forever. However, the preference of French and Latin after the invasion compelled the Anglo-Saxons to allow the influence of both while retaining its core components. The changes in grammar, spelling, structure, and pronunciation made it less challenging than the Old English, and this novel characteristic demarcates between the Old English and the Middle English. So basically, Middle English is the modified language of the Anglo-Saxons since the Norman conquest to the 1470s, when the Chaucery standard, considerably changed London-based English, became widespread and printing in English became regular. Moving on, it is important to learn the evolution of the language. Definitely, for a student who had read Beowulf, the language of Chaucer seems very different. Chaucer's is more understandable, which is the result of changes in both the grammatical system and the vocabulary of the language. The grammatical endings disappeared and the ruling French contributed to the vocabulary of the Middle English language, and this was the time when the clergy were still borrowing from the Latin. It is also important to note that until this period there wasn't any standard form of English. Let us now move to the socio-political events which played a significant role. As we all know, this period began with the Norman conquest of 1066, which yielded three great results. First, the Normans brought the ideals of Roman civilization home to the English people. This was at a critical time in England when her own literature and civilization had begun to decay. Second, they forced upon England a centralized government which, they thought, will replace the loose authority of a Saxon king. Third, they brought to England the wealth of a new language and literature, and English absorbed them both. The next event is that of the signing of the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter of the Liberties. The charter, drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, was signed by King John on the 12th of June in 1215. This came out as a result to bring peace between the highly unpopular king and the rebel parties. As a matter of fact, this document marked the beginning of the English Constitution. It is important to note that the tension between England and Normandy resulted in the English aristocracy being associated more with the English identity. The literature promoted the use of English in England. The wars during this period provoked further negative feelings towards French in England. Later, in 1349, English became the language of instructions at the University of Oxford, which until then had taught in French and Latin. The 100 Years' War broke out when the question of legitimate succession to the French crown arose. Actually, the 100 Years' War happened not for 100 years, but for 116 years precisely, with breaks in between. The war resulted in England being separated from the political ties with France. It is interesting to note the role of Joan of Arc of France, who was considered to be the creator of modern France. The event of Black Death in 1348 took away with it one-third of the population then. It was believed to be spread by a black variety of rats. This bubonic plague affected not just Britain but also many parts of Europe. Edward's son, the Black Prince, was also one of the victims of the plague. The Pleading in English Act of 1362 was an act of the Parliament of England. It stated that henceforth all proceedings in the law courts should be in English instead of French. It is also rendered as Statute of Pleading. With this understanding, let us now look into the early Middle English literature which was produced amidst these social and political unrests. Generally, the Middle English literature is divided into three categories as religious, courtly love, and Arthurian legends, which we'll be studying as early literature and later literature. The first noteworthy production is The Layman's Brood, completed in 1205 by Layman, a priest of Worcestershire. It takes the form of doggerel verse. This poem, which consists of some 30,000 lines, contains the legendary history of ancient Britain. Secondly, Orm's Omulum, written soon after Brut in 1215, is of biblical explanation. This series of metrical homilies is especially known for its unique phonetic orthography in short lines without either rhyme or alliteration. This holds the details of the Middle English language. The next important work is that of The Owl and the Nightingale, another anonymous poem in this period. It is a didactic one completed about 1220, which discards alliteration and shows French influence. This verse romance is historically interesting as it revolves around two birds debating about a range of topics. Havelock the Dane and Thomas D. Hale's Love Run are other romances produced during the early Middle English period. Now, in the later Middle English literature, we have the Cursor Mundi completed in 1320, which is a very long poem dealing with universal history. It shows the dealing of God with man from creation to doomsday, which also includes many legends of the saints. During this period, one of the most interesting Arthurian romances, that of Sir Gawain and the Green Knights, was produced. Though these romances originated from French sources, the English workmanship is the finest of our early romances. The same unknown poet has written The Pearl. The Pearl, written about 1350, is an intensely human and realistic picture of a father's grief of his little daughter. It is said to be the saddest of our early poems. Another prominent work is William Langland's Political and Religious Pious Plowman. This is an alliterative verse with a complex blend of religious themes. Also, the first evidence of Robin Hood tales are said to be found in this work. For centuries, literature has been busy pleasing the upper classes, but here is the work, at last, which appealed directly to the common people. This yielded a huge success for the work. Following this is Confessio Amantis of John Gower, which is a 33,000-line poem of consolation. It was one of his 3 long poems. In the era before printing press, this was the most copied manuscripts after the Canterbury Tales. In this work, he has introduced tales to illustrate the evils wrought by the 7 deadly sins. During this period of the late 12th century rose the greatest English poet who came to be known as the father of English poetry, who is none other than Geoffrey Chaucer. His notable works besides the Canterbury Tales include Roman of the Rose, which is a translation of the French Roman de la Rose, Troilus and Cresside, and Legend of Good Women. His literary period could be divided into three periods, namely the French, Italian, and English. At this point of our discussion, 2 important literary figures are to be studied about, the first one being Geoffrey of Monmouth. He is said to have lived around the 1100s. His notable work is that of the History of the Kings of Britain, which was found to be highly inaccurate, but still it played a vital role in inculcating patriotism. He has popularized King Arthur and his Excalibur, which is the legendary sword of King Arthur, which is believed to possess magical powers as well. The other distinct figure is that of Robert Manning of Brunn, who is specially remembered for his autobiographical elements in his works. Other writers during his time didn't even bother to sign their works, so when Robert Manning talked about himself in his works, it gave him a unique place in history, and it was quite easy to track history. His 2 remarkable works include Handling Sin and Manning's Chronicle. Handling Sin is considered to be the first confessional manual in English. This work also has a religious coloring of the author's own opinions on religion. Manning's Chronicle is history written in verse. Later historians and literary critics believe that this work isn't original but a mere translation of the Old English texts. Nevertheless, it holds a special place in the history of English literature. Now, coming back to the main topic, we find ourselves summing up the salient features of the latter half of the 14th century. This was the time when English was consolidating itself as a written language, taking over from French and Latin. Also, there was an increase in the number of copied manuscripts and books. This was due to the vernacular book production, both secular and religious. Alongside, great literature was being produced in Scotland. The group of writers termed themselves or called themselves as Scottish Chaucerians since they imitated Chaucer. This began with the writing of The King Esquire by James I of Scotland. He directly imitated the works of Chaucer while preserving his own uniqueness. The other poets include Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, and Gavin Douglas. They adopted Chaucer's style to their individualistic and nationalistic purposes and produced savage satires. William Dunbar's The Thistle and the Rose was produced to mark the wedding of King James IV of Scotland to Princess Margaret Tudor of England. Douglas' version of Virgil's Aeneid is one of the early monuments of Renaissance literary humanism in English. Now we shall see about the first English printer, William Caxton, and his contribution to English. Caxton was a technician rather than a writer. He is credited with the standardization of English language through printing. This facilitated the expansion of English vocabulary, inflection, and syntax as well. He had translated a large number of works into English and 26 of the titles himself. He had printed 4/5 of his works and as many as 108 books. However, the English language was changing rapidly during his time and he was given works dealing with a variety of styles and dialects. Having discussed these, it is time to sum up some of the salient features of the age. First of all, in the Middle English period, we see English language attaining maturity and popularity, and we find the dominance of anonymous authorship because the sense of private ownership had not yet come into being in a strong way. We also find that it was only towards the later period that a sense of individualism began to emerge. At the same time, the process of manually reproducing books had its own drawbacks. Chances were there that words and ideas could get altered or forgotten or left out. With the advent of printing press, books became expensive and were considered as prestigious property. So people relied on manuscripts and oral transmission of writings. We also noted that religion played a distinct role in defining and shaping many of the happenings, including the shaping of literature. And the Renaissance was such an important movement that a visit to Italy was considered mandatory for any educated person. His education and capability to produce art was not considered complete until he visited any one of the centers of Renaissance in Italy. With this, we come to an end of the Middle English period. Thank you.